Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and indeed it builds upon what's just been said. So I'm going to be a little bit more specific of what direction do I think we're actually travelling in. Let's make sure I know how to make this thing go. Yes, fine. So what I want to quickly do is talk about the importance of national and international research programmes, the role of assessments, and the role of scientific advisory committees. And I'll do that by talking about Future Earth as a research programme, the IPBES, which I've become the vice chair of. I'm on the transition team for Future Earth, the IPBES, and then just literally one slide on the importance of science and technology advisors and advisory committees. It's very, very clear that good science is essential for informed policy, but it's not efficient, not sufficient. Ministers have to make decisions taking into account knowledge about science, and when I talk about science, I do mean natural sciences, social sciences, economics, etc. And so clearly we have to recognise we have a role to play in informed decision making, but we have to realise we do not possess the answers ourselves. So fundamentally it's quite critical, oops-a-daisy, sorry, it's quite critical, this is now, let's see, where are we going? Fine. It's quite critical that we do have natural social sciences working there, and it's absolutely critical now, as we all know, they must be multidisciplinary, there's no question. We've clearly got to coordinate these disparate programmes of the World Climate Research Programme, International Geosphere Biosphere Programme, International Human Dimensions Programme, Diverse and the Earth System Science Programme, and we are now doing that through this programme called Future Earth, which I'll talk about. National, international, multidisciplinary scientific assessments, absolutely crucial, but they're only going to work if all stakeholder groups are involved and they are demand-driven, not supply-driven. One of the real big challenges I think we've now got is how do we bring together local, traditional and indigenous knowledge with what I call the more modern scientific knowledge out of universities, government institutions, etc. And there's some really power asymmetries here. But if we don't do this on issues such as agriculture, water management, biodiversity, we will have failed tremendously. So the issue yesterday about sheep farmers in Cumbria, absolutely critical. We need to understand local knowledge. When you do an assessment, though, the challenge is much of this knowledge is not written down. How do we bring together in a national or an international assessment local knowledge that's not written down, not peer-reviewed, with a more classical peer-reviewed knowledge in the scientific journals? And that, to me, is going to be one of our really key challenges. If we don't bring all relevant stakeholders together, all relevant stakeholders in both co-design and co-production of both scientific programs and assessments, again, I think fundamentally we're going to fail. And it's quite clear that policymakers do want a consensus view, but what consensus means is, do we agree on what we think we know, what is unknown, what are the uncertainties, and what are the controversial issues that have to be dealt with? So fundamentally, the assessment processes, they clearly need to be credible, transparent, legitimate. There's no question whatsoever. But if we don't understand the needs, the values of society, then we're going to actually miss it. Clearly, inter- and intra-generational equity is absolutely vital. And if we don't recognise the complexity of the socio-political system and the way the political process works, the political realities, again, we will fail in our job to either not produce the knowledge that's needed or how to assess the knowledge that's needed. Clearly, one has to talk about the consequences of action and inaction, both in an economic standpoint, the natural sciences, the ethical, the moral issues. And this is absolutely crucial as we give knowledge. What are the implications of an action? What are the potential implications of inaction? Obviously, when one looks forward, one has to think through the issue of policies, technologies, financial incentives, behaviour change, and absolutely crucial, and it really builds on. Clearly, we have to look at the issues in the context of what the average person in society cares about. They don't care about climate change per se or loss of biodiversity, not the average person. They clearly care about food, energy, water and human security, and we clearly have to recognise that. What are the features for success? The obvious one, ownership by everybody, ownership of the process. It's a fair and open process. People may disagree with the final results. They may not like some of the inconvenient truths, but they have to view that the process is a valid, legitimate process that involves all issues. I've already said we need all key players. We clearly need balance, intellectual balance across the natural and social research. They clearly have to be geographically balanced if indeed it's going to be a global assessment. Experts must be there in their individual capacity. They must not be there to represent a government or a sector, etc. The challenge I've already talked about is how do you bring traditional and institutional knowledge together, and fundamentally it must be a totally open process, otherwise it's not going to be recognised. Peer review, absolutely critical, and it has to be peer reviewed by all relevant stakeholders, all relevant experts. Well, what's an expert? An expert is simply someone who has knowledge that's relevant to the issue. It could be a local farmer. It could be an indigenous group. It could be a university professor. So fundamentally, we have to recognise expertise is someone who has knowledge that is relevant to the subject that we're actually talking about. Clearly, review editors absolutely important, just like they are in a journal, when you do an assessment, to make sure that when you do the peer review, the authors are responsive to the review process itself. Policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. Absolutely critical. Clearly the key thing is present an ensemble of options. If you want to achieve something, what's the ensemble of options you have in front of you, whether it's in government or the private sector? If you want to avoid something, what's the ensemble of options that can avoid something? Never try, in my opinion, never try and give single recommendations. They really are the way to go. Classical issue, but very hard, is evidence-based and ideological. The agricultural assessment I directed was the hardest thing I've ever directed. Why? 3 issues: genetic modification, agrochemicals, and international trade. And boy, people on both sides, very selective use of evidence to promote their position on GM, for or against, their position on international trade, for or against, or their position on pesticides, for or against. So one clearly has to try and differentiate these particular issues. Clearly we need risk assessment, risk management, must present different views, uncertainty, etc. The outreach communication strategy must start at the beginning of the process, not at the end, which quite often we do. And clearly we need multi-thematic, spatial, temporal, and multiple sponsors. The international ozone assessments, they were intergovernmental, they were expert period, phenomenally influential. We've now banned all long-lived chlorine and bromine containing compounds, most of the medium-lived ones and many of the shorter-lived ones. A very, very successful process. IPCC, if we didn't have it, we would absolutely have to invent it. Again, very influential on the national and international stage, albeit limited value in Congress, basically. But you do have to be intelligent enough to read them. We've got the International Agriculture Assessment. Its impact is increasing. We were absolutely trashed when we released this, saying that smallholder farmers had a real role in the future, where other people said no, clearly got to go to large-scale farms. Clearly the solution to hunger in small villages in Africa was actually going to scale using genetic modification. Completely, utterly wrong. The reason that we've got so much poverty and hunger through parts of sub-Saharan Africa is all of rural development is totally screwed up. Fundamentally, it's not an issue of technology, it's an issue of rural development, empowering women, microfinance, roads to get to market, etc., basically. And so some of the thought processes in the Ag Assessment are now being embraced even by the World Bank, who originally tried to trash the whole thing. The Global Biodiversity Assessment, wonderful document, 1,200 pages, absolutely useless in the policy process because it was supply driven by the scientific community. I chaired it. We didn't actually go and ask people, what information do you actually want? We learnt that by the time we went to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and we actually tied it to some big intergovernmental processes like the CBD, the CCD, but we also went to the private sector, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, and it's clearly, slowly but surely, influencing the thinking in the CBD, the thinking in the CCD, and many national processes. The UK Ecosystem Assessment, which I was lucky enough to co-chair, probably the most successful, other than the ozone assessment, most successful assessment ever. We really did try to look at what was happening in the UK from just after the Second World War to 50 years into the future. And it had an immediate impact on policy. And it was the first white paper on the environment in 20 years, the Natural Environment White Paper for England. And the reason is we brought the right combination together. of natural scientists, economists and social researchers to really look at the issue of what was happening to our habitats, what was happening to ecosystem processes and how is it affecting human well-being in the UK. We're now doing a second phase of this, which has even more social researchers, more economists involved, less natural scientists. The IPBES has just been formed and I've got several slides on it, and so I won't actually look at this at the moment. However, I think the question is it now time to think about this totally differently? Why do we keep having these international assessments that, broad as they are, such as IPCC, the IPBES, the Global Energy Assessment, GEO, etc., now is the time to bring them all together in a web-based electronic system, which can look at the interlinkages in more profound detail between the environmental issues and the development issues. One of the problems with the MDGs is they're great goals, but they never looked at the interlinkages between food, poverty, health, water, etc. And this is when a challenge for the SDGs in the future, not what should the SDGs be in isolation, but how do they work together? We need an assessment process that looks at the interlinkages among the drivers, among the environmental issues, and among the development issues, and really look at the linkages. And I think it's time we rethought how to do assessment processes. I've chaired a couple of our meetings on this, and I think there's an appetite for it, but and we would have to start at scale, but it would have to cover everything that the IPCC, the IPBES, the Ag Assessment Team, the Global Energy Assessment has been doing. I think this is very doable. Now is the time to rethink the way we do assessment processes. So what is Future Earth? Well, it is research for global sustainability. It is aimed to provide knowledge required for societies in the world to work together. It will integrate these four large programs and the interlinked programs. So how can we managerially, but even more important, intellectually, bring these four big programs together? The conceptual framework's a fairly straightforward one. It actually looks very similar to what we use on the Millennium Ecosystem. But this is for the whole issue of Earth science. And that is, what are the drivers of change, both human and natural? How do they interact themselves? So the first part is interaction within each block. What are all of the global environmental changes, but not just global, the regional issues such as our water pollution, air quality, etc., and some of the local issues. So how do the drivers affect the environment at all scales? How do the environmental issues themselves interact with each other, i.e. climate change is linked to biodiversity, which is linked to air quality, which is linked to water quality. So we have to understand the interlinkages. But what are the facets of human well-being that we care about? And they are the social aspects, they are the economic aspects, etc. But the key is, how do we transform? How do we transform the way we're working together today to a more equitable and socially responsible society? So the key to success of this is, what are the transformations and solutions? And solutions is not single, it's options for action, options for solutions. So it will have to work at all scales, local to global, and we have to understand what the boundaries are. So the approach is, what are the transformations within a dynamic plan and the whole development process. So it is absolutely a program aimed at societal needs. And so the key is development, food, water, energy security, human security, the transformation processes that are required from local to global scale, technologies, policies, economic systems, and how does the planet work. And this very simply says, dynamic planet, do we understand our planet? What's the driving force and what are the interactions? The development was, how do we link environmental issues to issues such as food, water, biodiversity, health, energy? And the whole process down here is, do we understand the way society works, the way it relates to human values? What is the role of emerging technologies? How can we transform the economic pathways, etc.? This is absolutely crucial, and that is the governance structure that we play. Overall, there will be a governing council. It will have on it basically some of the major funders in the world, some of the big organisations like UNEP, UNESCO, etc. But this is the crucial part. Below the governing council is a science committee to think through what the science challenges are. But this, to me, is the crucial part, the engagement committee. The role of society, people from government, the private sector, NGOs, indigenous people must all be on the engagement committee. I'm going to France next week or the week after to work through with ICSU and ISSC how to put an engagement committee that's equally important to the science committee in how do you pose the questions. What are the challenges for society from totally different viewpoints? How do they think through what's needed in a research program? And so I think this is the new part, is to make sure an engagement committee, co-design, co-production, co-delivery, exchange of ideas, basically. I've already pointed out these are the basic points, and let's say the key issue is co in all cases, and the secretariat to run the whole thing. So I think that will be a major step in the right direction to produce information. IPBES, very similar to the IPCC at one level, and that is to help understand and improve the science policy interface. I'll be one of the vice chairs of this, and the key is indeed, as I say, it's an interface between the science and policy. I would prefer now to call it the decision-making communities. Policy is very much government. It's got to speak far more than just government. It's got to speak to the private sector, local communities, NGOs. The principles are obvious. We all look at the terrestrial marine water system. It's multidisciplinary. Gender is crucial, not just a top-down process. Much of this will be absolutely bottom-up. What's needed at the national level, the regional level, participation, absolutely a developing policy relevant but not prescriptive. How do we bring in indigenous and local knowledge, and how do we make the whole thing independent, credible, relevant? The plenary will make the decision. Over 100 governments are now members. There will be observers with voice, but not with voting, if indeed we ever vote. We're going to try and do everything by consensus. A bureau of 10 people, 2 from each UN region. I think it's a superb bureau, actually. It's already functioning incredibly well. And an independent, multidisciplinary expert panel at the moment, 5 scientists from each of the 5 UN regions that will oversee the scientific functions. The bureau members are also observers to the MEP, and so these two will work very, very closely together. The 4 big functions: knowledge generation, regular and timely assessments, support policy formulation with tools and capacity building. The types of things we potentially will do but yet to be finally decided will be regular assessments at the regional and very important sub-regional level, as well as the global scale. My guess is we'll start the regional, sub-regional first, and a year or 2 later we'll start the global. There'll be thematic issues, maybe ocean acidification, loss of pollinators, loss of amphibians, those types of things. Clearly we've got to build capacity building to support the national assessment activities, that's absolutely, and clearly a common conceptual framework and tools for how do you do it. There obviously will be policy support, and we need to make sure that we don't throw information over the parapet to governments or the private sector. How do you use this information? What are the tools for decision making? How do you do valuation, both economic and non-economic? How do you look at shared social values, individual social values of cultural services? How do you look at market and non-market values of biodiversity and ecosystem services, basically? And so clearly we have to think through the whole issue of how to do capacity building, which is a very, very important issue, both for developed and developing countries. So clearly, you know, there can be things such as, and we've got to think this through much more carefully, workshops and training, scholarships, fellowships, peer-to-peer exchange visit. But it's education and capacity. It's not north-south, it's north-north, south-south, and south-north in both directions. We can learn from each other, basically, and this is going to be a very critical element, much more explicit on capacity building than in the IPCC. And in the knowledge generation is identification of gaps, then working with ICSU, working with ISSC, Future Earth, government funding agencies to say what are the gaps, how do we try and fill these gaps. We've now got a bureau. Dr. Zachary from Malaysia will chair it. We've got the 25 members of the MEP. We've almost finished all the rules of procedure. Very boring, but absolutely critical for success. I chaired the rules of procedure part. We've got a very aggressive intersessional work programme. UNEP will provide the administrative functions, but UNDP, UNESCO and UNDP, equally vitally important, absolutely important. UNESCO, obviously the science, the cultural and education issues. UNDP because of the development framework. Obviously, it's meant to say FAO here, sorry. And FAO, because the whole role of forestry and agriculture is absolutely critical. We do have to finalise a detailed work programme. We have to agree on the spatial structure of the regional, sub-regional assessment. We have to finalise the conceptual framework that works over temporal and spatial scales, brings together different knowledge systems. We have to decide whether or not we will have regional hubs around the world, which I think very strongly we need in order to have ownership of the process. And we have to decide whether or not IPBES should be transformed from a purely independent intergovernmental body into one that's more closely associated with the UN. From my point of view, absolutely irrelevant. We'll have our own rules of procedure, so it's irrelevant to what degree we are or are not linked to the UN. But it's a major political issue, especially for a lot of countries, especially in Africa. The conceptual framework is a variant. This is an initial draft conceptual framework. There'll be a workshop later this year to look at this draft conceptual framework to see does it work or not. It's a variant of the one we used in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a variant of the one we used in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment, but fundamentally it goes from human well-being to the whole way biodiversity and ecosystems function. What effectively are the goods and services back to human well-being? So what are the drivers for change, and how then effectively does society, how does it affect biodiversity? How is it affected by biodiversity? Clearly we've got to recognise that we've got to put this in what's the value of natural capital. GDP is clearly a limited and flawed concept, but how do you look at natural capital in relationship to human capital, built capital and financial capital? And I think there's a mistake. We should have another word, social capital there basically. But the whole issue is what are the institutions, the decisions and the drivers. Very, very similar if you look at it to what we're doing on Future Earth. So we're starting to think of a conceptual framework that is co-designed, involves all major players. And the last thing I would like to say is I actually believe the UK programme of having a chief scientific advisor for each government department that working, and the key is working together in a highly collegial and integrated manner, is a model that could be replicated by other governments. Governments should have independent multidisciplinary science advisory committees. DEFRA had one, very valuable to challenge me, to challenge DEFRA, absolutely crucial basically. I would argue each government should have a science and technology advisor. You heard yesterday from Anne, it's only the UK, Ireland and Czechoslovakia in Europe. US has got one, Canada's got one, Japan has one, but they really are too few. And I think this establishment of the Multidisciplinary Science Advisory Board, chaired by the head of UNESCO, which I think is a great decision, that I think is really going to help and advise and strengthen the science policy process, advising not only the Secretary General of the UN, but advising the whole UN system. So I think this is a major step then improving the interface between science and policy within the UN system. And the conclusion is obvious. We need strong national, because international programs cannot be strong unless the national program. And so a key challenge is strengthening the research programs in developing countries. They need to be transdisciplinary. We clearly need assessments that are transdisciplinary. We need advisors, and the whole issue is we've got to really change in the way that we do things. So co-design, co-production, absolutely critical, involving all relevant stakeholders. Thank you.